let me explain what we're getting ready to do here. First of all, before we start, I want to give my personal thanks to our marketing department, and I'd like to single out Connie Kelly and Lexi Zukowski, who helped me with these slides. What we've decided to do, there's so much grim news and so much has been written and talked about regarding what's happened to the world economy, and so much blame has been placed upon the securitization market, which I did have a major part in, but I plead total innocence. I never worked on a single subprime residential mortgage security. I never worked on a single CDO. And so I was in another part of the market that's done quite well. Thank you very much. No downgrades and no defaults, knock on wood. But we're all collateral damage, not just people in the securitization market. We're all collateral damage. And so what we decided to do is base this on a novel that many of you may be familiar with, and if you're not familiar with it, you really need to be more literate. In case you're not familiar with it, let me give you a really quick rib note. This is a novel, The Lord of the Flies, about a group of children that were landed actually through a plane crash on an island. And there was no adult supervision, i.e. no regulation. And they were basically left to their own devices to create their own social compacts and just sort of get along. And so what we've decided to do, and Jonathan is going to be helping me out with this, is we're borrowing from Mr. Golding's title and from his plot. And we're calling it The Lords of the Flies, because there's obviously more than one lord here. The subtitle is The Beast That Killed Securitization as We Know It and Almost Destroyed the Global Financial System. So let's start with chapter 1. This is the beginning. This is just discovering the island, kind of exploring it, laying it out, figuring out what's there. And it got all started in the early 1970s when the same GSEs who were very much in the headlines over the last several months, Ginnie Mae, Fannie, particularly Fannie and Freddie, invented securitization. And they invented it as a way to increase liquidity in the U.S. residential housing market. It was all about helping the homeowner. Legitimate goal and a great result. The alchemy of securitization, as we talked about it in those days, and as I talk about it in the class that I teach at the Morin Center, is that you really do turn base metals into gold, but you do it by isolating assets that on their own, or as held by the originator, has no rating, has no status in life. They're simply residential loans or whatever. You isolate them from the bankruptcy risk of the originators. You structure cash flows among various classes, what we call tranches. And in this particular case, with the GSEs, they provided a guarantee, a backstop, and they achieved ratings of AAA. This was a very vibrant concept, a very vibrant market. And this was the paradigm, those of you who've taken the course are sick, probably as you can be of this structure, but of this diagram, but this is the paradigm of securitization. The asset creators in the upper left, we call it the originator sometimes, but if we were kids, we'd probably call it an asset creator. It sells the assets to an issuer, which is a special purpose entity. The issuer issues bonds through bond underwriters. The bonds are sold to investors. The proceeds come back to the trustee. The assets are pledged to the trustee by the SPE issuer, and the asset creator gets the proceeds. And by doing this, and this is the model that's been followed millions of times, this is how we've created this alchemy. Now, once they settled the island, they figured out how to do that game plan. They then started settling it and exploring it. And so this is just a brief, just a little bit of a spotlight on several years along the way. Between the years 1974 and 1980, in the aggregate, the total issuance volume of private label. This is not even including the agency issue, but the private label mortgage-backed securities aggregated around $100 billion between 74 and 80. In the year 89, on its own, it was about that same level, about $100 billion of new issuance volume. In 92, it went up to about $480 billion. And in 2001, it was up over around $750 billion of new issuance every year. And then what happened, and these are all really good things, in my view, the securitization technology moved beyond residential mortgages to a lot of other assets, a lot of other types of assets. And we call those asset-backed securities. And it included credit card receivables, auto loans, commercial real estate loans, trade receivables, tobacco fees, which is near and dear to our hearts, Brown Rudnick, whole business securitizations, intellectual property, and structural settlements. And the list is much, much longer than this. There's a huge number of cash flowing assets that have been the subject of this paradigm. So following the trend for these new types of asset-backed securities, that issuance volume, it started out as virtually nothing in 1985. In 86, as you can see, it was maybe several billions of dollars. In 88, same. 89, still about 20 billion. 1990, maybe around 50 billion of new issuance. By 2003, this market had grown to about $550 billion of annual issuance. This is just ABS. This is not mortgage-backed securities. So we're talking real numbers here. Now, what were the drivers of all this growth? Well, as I said, initially the driver was to provide liquidity to the residential housing market. Another driver was to finance commercial real estate projects. They wanted to use this, banks use this to, and finance companies use it to provide funding for credit card and auto finance programs and other types of consumer assets, all to make this economy work, to really basically provide cash into the lives of everyday Americans and people around the world. And then future flow contracts, just various types of contracts that had future revenues associated with them, became the subject of the securitization. And other business functions, so businesses in general plugged into this market to finance their operations. Now there was a common denominator. I say this was still during the sort of the good halcyon days of securitization. The common denominator, the common driver, was the issuers were driving this market. The people that were going to use the proceeds of the securitizations were driving it. Either it was the homeowner that wanted liquidity in the residential housing market, or it was the finance companies and the banks that wanted liquidity in their credit cards so they could roll the money over and make new loans or issue new credit. And that's what the driver was. And there was a great fort that was built on this island. And I'd like to describe what the fort was, because this is all about protecting these children from bad things. The fort had a number of mainstays in it. We had, at the very top of this chart, the rating agencies. The rating agencies were supposed to do the following: careful statistical analysis, rigorous stress testing, independent risk assessment, and they were going to publish their opinions, but these were opinions that were relied on around the world of how to rate these securities. Coming around clockwise, the bond insurers got into the business. They were AAA rated insurance companies. They put AAA ratings onto the bonds by providing financial guarantees. Again, independent risk assessment, strong balance sheets, financial guarantees. The investors were also this is a mostly institutional investor market. They were independent in their due diligence. They were supposed to have knowledge of the collateral. They were also going to review, obviously, the documentation and the disclosure on these deals to make sure they knew what they were buying. Inside the banks who were issuing and underwriting these securities, you had a very strong risk management function. They were supposed to protect the interests of the shareholders of the bank. They were supposed to basically put a halt to overly risky trades. They were supposed to also just independently risk monitor the activities of their bankers who were on the deal side of the house. The lawyers, of course, do what lawyers always do expertly: independent legal judgment, stringent due diligence, and very careful documentation and diligence and disclosure. The bankruptcy remote issuers, which was what we started with in the diagram, were to provide protection against the bankruptcy of the companies that originated these loans. They're bankruptcy remote from these assets. They were not going to be consolidated back with those originators under some rigorous legal analysis, and they were special purpose. But the beast was prowling this island, and it appeared in various forms, although not recognized at the time. And what we're going to do is we're going to highlight 3 forms in which the beast appeared. First of all, the beast appeared in subprime, or what's known as Alt-A, which is a slightly higher grade of subprime, residential mortgage-backed securities. This is the original idea of securitization, right? It was to provide liquidity in the residential market, but they dipped lower into the credit scale when they went into subprime. Another form in which the beast appeared was something called structured investment vehicles. We're not going to have a lot of time, or any time really, to talk about those, but those were a really nifty way for banks to create off-balance sheet financings using short-term borrowing to buy long-term assets. Great, great spreads. And then there were the collateralized debt obligations, which we will get into. This is a brief description of the subprime residential mortgage-backed securities game plan. If you'll notice, it looks exactly like the other diagrams that we've put up there, or the paradigm that I put up there. The difference is the quality of the assets that went into these pools. They were high leverage. They were low and sometimes no down payments, unqualified borrowers. They assumed in the underwriting and in the rating of these securities the continuing increase in home values and sucker rates with adjustments. You know the story of the subprime meltdown. And if you'll notice, there were all these tranches going on. They took tranching to a high level with different classes of bonds issued to the investors. The bond insurers got into the act. They were insuring these things in the billions, in the hundreds of billions. The CDO, or collateralized debt obligation, involves something a little bit different. First of all, these were actively managed portfolios of assets. The bank or whoever originated these deals put everything but the kitchen sink into the CDOs. They put in asset-backed securities. They put in commercial real estate interests. They threw subprime residential mortgage securities into these CDOs and other financial assets. Then they issued multiple classes of bonds to the investors. The bond insurers were right there on the scene, providing additional financial guarantees. The CDO manager had the right to vary these investments to allegedly keep properly aligned the various risk profiles of the underlying investments. Okay, now the beast, as I said, appeared somewhat in disguised form. Now we're coming face to face. And Jonathan is going to take us a little bit closer to this source of evil.
He's not the beast.
That's to the right.
It's interesting that Ron chose me to be the beast. So we talked a little bit about how this thing got out of control. Well, CDOs were a great way to get fees. And really one of the things that you're trying to do is you're trying to take different asset classes of of debt and put it into one vehicle and then issue another layer of securities off of that. And when you issue another layer of securities off of that, everybody gets fees. That's lawyers, that's investment bankers, everybody else. So one of the things that they realized is, well, you know, we can take the securities of CDOs. And remember when we looked at Ron's slide, you had Class A bonds, Class B bonds, Class C bonds, Class D bonds, Class E through N. Class A bonds, those are super senior securities. Those really tended to stay with financial institutions and the monoline insurers. We don't have enough time to describe that. But all the other classes could go into a CDO, and they might be packaged up with RMBS securities and other things, and that's what we call a CDO squared. Now we get into the synthetic CDO game plan, and I think some of you folks have heard of credit default swaps. And one of the ways that they could go out there and they could have a game plan was they could say, look, now we can actually take the credit default swap liability, put it into a CDO, which had responsibility as an issuer under that credit default swap. It would write the credit default swaps, get the premiums off the credit default swaps, and then we'd issue securities, and their obligation would be to fund the credit default swaps should everything eventually blow up. And that's, again, another way to get fees, and it creates synthetic exposure to reference portfolios of assets, meaning they basically were going out, and this becomes a mini insurance company. So we get some reflections on the synthetic CDO. Really nothing but a securitization of a pool of side bets. There is nothing to restrain issuance volume of synthetic CDOs other than the availability of counterparties. And in a way, there's a great way to get fees because as long as the thing doesn't blow up, you're getting premiums from the issuance of the synthetic CDO. You don't have to, you know, it's like when lawyers go and have a party sign a guarantee. The guarantee in some ways is easy because you're not paying current cash. But if everything blows up, then you've got a very big liability. CDO issuers, nothing but unregulated virtual insurance companies. I think we talked about it. They weren't regulated, but they sure were insuring against risks. And there really was no there. I mean, if this whole thing blows up, then you're basically chasing some bond issuers. This is an interesting quote from somebody who basically shorted the entire market, Steve Eisman. And what Steve Eisman did is he started realizing what was happening with securitization. So he went out there and he started doing short trades against the entire securitization industry. And you know, one of the things he was doing was residential mortgage-backed securities, and he would short all the industries that were built up around the investment banks. He would short the investment bank stock because he said, wow, this is a real big house of cards. It's all going to fall. And he said, the moment I really realized how crazy this had gotten was when he was talking with one of the traders, and they were saying, I love you. And they were saying, why do you love me? I'm shorting your entire industry. And he says, yeah, but we're taking those credit default swaps, we're putting it into a CDO, and we're issuing securities off of it, and we're making fees. This is great. So what was happening is the shorting of the industry itself became the basis for making a fee. And I think that's my chance to turn it back over to Ron.
Really are a piece.
Okay, so chapter 6, the breaching of the fort, basically. You remember that diagram I showed you earlier with all the spears and all the fortifications? Well, here's where we ended up. A massive, probably the greatest massive misalignment of interest in the history of finance. Let's start with the rating agencies at the top. Their statistical analysis was flawed because they made one dangerous assumption that we would never have, because we haven't in the past, we've never had a massive decline of real estate values across the United States, the residential values. They also bent to competitive pressure. The issuers paid their fees, and they actually started having to get more aggressive in their ratings because they were going to lose market share. They were for-profit companies like everybody else. And they had conflicts of interest. The issuers would take them out to play golf. They got into great, you know, personal, social relationships, and it just didn't work. The bond insurers, they were guilty of flawed risk assessments, fatal exposure to bad risk, and eventually, and they were after all the fees that they were getting out of this market, and they eventually suffered huge rating downgrades, which makes them totally ineffective as bond insurers. They only have their ratings to sell. The investors relied on, guess what? The bond insurers and the rating agencies. They never looked at the underlying collateral. They never looked at very few of them ever read the documents or the disclosure. The bank risk managers were overridden by senior management, and the reason they were overridden is senior management was interested in making sure that their top talent would stay next year. And whether they stayed or not was dependent upon the size of their bonus. And they had to keep this machine going, or their bonuses would not equal the bonuses of their competing shops. So the function of the bank risk manager basically became irrelevant. And we're actually almost done here. The lawyers truncated their due diligence. There was very little due diligence as these deals started getting done. I mean, the typical time it takes for us to do a transaction in our space is anywhere between 3 months and sometimes 2 years. These deals were being run out at the rate of about 1 a week. They were obviously using fill-in-the-blanks documentation and assembly line closings. The bankruptcy remote issuers, they remain bankruptcy remote, at least to date. No one's challenged that. The problem was if you put bad assets inside a bankruptcy remote entity, what good have you done? So the whole fort was breached. Another way to put it is that the securitization paradigm got corrupted. That original paradigm that I threw up on the screen has been completely turned on its head. And the new alchemy was to not take good assets and have them analyzed by the rating agencies and putting them in bankruptcy remote vehicles and issue multi-tranche securities. They actually took collateral that had already been rated. The average rating on a CDO underlying collateral was B+. The majority of the tranches issued out of these CDOs that we had on the screen was AAA. So I mean, alchemy is one thing, but how do you take already rated B+ securities and come out with AAA ratings for the majority of your tranches? The collateral really ceased to be important. The collateral is simply a way of filling purchase orders. You had to keep issuing these bonds because there was an insatiable demand by the investors. And the investors were after yield. And in fact, as Jonathan pointed out, the collateral was absolutely unnecessary in the synthetic CDOs. Why bother with actually buying residential mortgages? Why don't we just write credit default swaps, which gives us the same exposure as owning the assets themselves? And another way to put it is that the securitization technology was basically converted from a finance vehicle to an arbitrage vehicle. What was common about all this in this new paradigm? It was all capital markets driven. The issuers, the people that needed the cash, had very little to do with this. This is all about creating deal flow and creating bonuses. So just real quickly, this is what the world looked like coming up to the crash. These were CDO issuance volume numbers through 2007. As you'll see, in 2006, just CDOs alone, there was about $550 billion new issuance, and slightly less in the following year. The overall securitization issuance volume in 2007 was over $3 trillion around the world. And now post-meltdown, these are now not, you know, look at the scale on the left is different. We're now, in 2008, had global ABS issuance of about 40 billion all around the world, about 15 billion in 2009. CDO issuance, the same. 2008 issuance was 140 billion in 2008, and in 2009 it's down to a trickle. So just two quotes to end with. Back to Michael Lewis. We're quoting Michael Lewis because he wrote this amazingly witty and on-point piece in Portfolio.com a couple of months ago called The End of Wall Street's Boom. He wrote The Liar's Poker, in case you don't remember that. And they said that this whole phenomenon at the end was like feeding the monster. We fed the monster until it blew up. And then if you want to go back to the original source, in Chapter 8 of Lord of the Flies, the hero has come face to face with the beast. And the beast is actually a pig's head on a stick. And I won't explain how we got there. And the beast and he have this imaginary conversation, and he says to the hero, there isn't anyone to help you, only me, and I'm the beast. Fancy you thinking the beast was something you could hunt and kill. You knew, didn't you? I'm part of you. I'm the reason why it's no-go, why things are the way they are. So what's the moral of our tale? The moral of our tale is that if you give even the best of tools to a bunch of children without any parental supervision, human nature being what it is, they could mess it up. And they did mess it up. And my view is that this is not the end of securitization. This is the end of securitization as we know it. It's needed to even bring us out of the current mess that we're in. There will be new forms, there will be new structures, and there will definitely be parents in the room.